We now turn our attention to mainland China and look at the last Chinese imperial dynasty to rule that great country, the Qing dynasty. Pictured here is the last emperor of China, Pu Yi, who went by the name Henry Pu Yi later on. He lived from 1906 to 1967. As a young boy, he was deposed as ruler but allowed to live in the Forbidden City. Then he was deposed as emperor and thrown out of Beijing when the Republic of China was created in the 1920s. The Japanese then sponsored him and had him reinstalled as a puppet emperor in his home province of Manchuria. When the Japanese Kwangtung army left Manchuria after the Second World War, Pu Yi was captured and held by the Soviets for 5 years and then turned over to the Chinese communists who had him imprisoned in a re-education camp. Declared rehabilitated by Mao Zedong and the communists in 1959, he worked as a gardener in and around the Forbidden City in Beijing, where he had once ruled, and then as a newspaper editor for a communist organization. Pu Yi was the last of the Qing dynasty and escaped execution as a war criminal because the communists wanted him to be an example of how an imperialist could become an ordinary citizen. Like with many states throughout history, the last dynasty of China was not from the official Han heartland, but instead from the region of Manchuria to the northeast of China. Just like with Alexander the Great, who came from Macedon and then ruled Greece, and later Napoleon, who came from Corsica and ruled France. And you can even use later on the examples of Hitler, who came from Austria to rule Germany, and Stalin, who came from Georgia to rule Russia. The Qing dynasty were considered outsiders and reviled by the Chinese. Before we get to studying the Chinese history under the Qings, you'll probably notice throughout these notes that there are two different spellings for many of the same Chinese names and terms. The reason for this is that one form is called the Wade-Giles system of translation, which is named after British diplomats Thomas Francis Wade and Herbert A. Giles, who romanized the Chinese alphabet. The other is called the Hanyu Pinyin, or just Pinyin form of translation, which replaced the Wade-Giles system in the late 1950s as the translation of standard Mandarin Chinese and is the product of Chinese scholarship. For instance, when you go to eat Chinese food at restaurants like maybe Five Happiness, you will still see on their menus Peking duck, which at one time was named for the capital city of Peking, the capital of China. However, we have not referred to that city as Peking for more than half a century. Instead, under the Pinyin system, we call it Beijing. The Chinese nationalists who still rule the island of Formosa under the government of Taiwan are called the Kuomintang under the Wei-Giles system and still use that to this day, but under Pinyin they are called the Kuomintang. Chiang Kai-shek, the ruler of the Kuomintang, is changed to Jiang Jieshi. Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Chinese Communists and leader of the People's Republic of China, from 1949 to 1976 is changed to Mao Zedong. And, perhaps most famously, is the ancient Chinese philosopher and who has still a great deal of influence on China today, Confucius. Under the Wei-Giles system, this is what he was called, but his real name under the Pinyin is called Kung Fu Zi, or simply Master Kung. So now you see the more Chinese-oriented way of saying the names as opposed to the westernized way of saying the names. So how did the Manchurians, an outsider group of people, move into China and then take over in China, much the same way that Kublai Khan did centuries before? They moved into China and took the name Qing, which means pure. Their first ruler in Manchuria was named Nurhaci, a petty chief who became the Manchu Khan, and he unified the Jurchen or Manchurian tribes. He then conquered the Liaodong province in the northeast of Han China, more as a grievance movement against the declining Ming dynasty than it was as conquest. And in truth, the Qings became a dynasty by accident. The problem was is that the Ming dynasty had become so decrepit that it could not defend itself, and they saw in the Manchurians that they were very well organized and sufficiently militaristic that they could take care of the job for them. And so the Mings called in the Manchus to expel the raiders from Beijing, or Peking as it was called at the time. Well, when the Manchurians get there, they simply say, well, how about this? This is great. We simply are going to stay here, and threw the Mings out and established themselves as the last dynasty of China, although they did not know that at the time, and ruled from 1644 until 1912. Perhaps the most notable of the emperors during this time was Kangxi, and he ruled from 1661 until 1722. So he had quite a long reign. He was intelligent, he was wise, and was considered one of the greatest Chinese emperors of all time. He managed to subjugate all of China and expanded China to the territory where it exists today. He also invaded the island of Formosa, and that becomes Taiwan. And with the exception of Tibet, he establishes the map of China as we know it today. He becomes a great patron of the arts and learning. He ordered the compilation of a dictionary of Chinese characters. Now, what happened to the Ming dynasty when it was overthrown? Now, many of them said, okay, we'll go along with the Qing rule, and they assimilated into the Qing rule. But others fled China and established themselves in cities throughout East Asia. They created Chinese districts in these cities. For example, the Cholon district in Saigon, Vietnam. The Qings retained the Ming political and social structures, but issued more of an equality in society by conciliating the social classes. In addition, the Qings maintained their Manchu identity, especially their hairstyle that you see here in the illustration. The Qings brought great stability to the realm, which was reflected by the increase in the agricultural output that in turn created a population explosion and brought China to a level of close to 500 million people, half a billion people. Now, rice, of course, was the staple crop, although the Chinese also grew sweet potatoes, maize, and peanuts. And as I said, the Qings largely emulated the Mings in many ways, especially in culture and the arts. They simply put their own personal stamp on what was already a very well-established culture. They created elegant paintings. They wrote a history of all of China. That was Kangxi's doing. They became masters of astronomy. They wrote novels as well. And they excelled, as well as the Mings, in such crafts as porcelain. They were also great scientific inventors. They actually managed to create a Geiger counter that could measure earthquakes. The social life of the Qings also emulated the Mings with their numerous festivals like Dongzhi in December and the Lunar New Year, which in some places is called Tet, or the Chinese New Year as well. Of course, the Chinese New Year celebration is sort of like a combination of Easter and Mardi Gras and the 4th of July all rolled into one. There were great festivals that centered on marriages as well as birthdays and funerals. And remember that in the Chinese and other East Asian cultures, funeral garb is white and wedding garb is very colorful. Needless to say, missionaries made their way to China almost as soon as Marco Polo reached Beijing. And the vanguard of these missionaries were, of course, the Jesuits. Now, Francis Xavier had arrived on the coattails of the Portuguese with his mission to India, and he inspired a Jesuit named Matteo Ricci. to head the missionary journey to China. Ricci was an Italian Jesuit, and he used his scientific knowledge to create the Kunyu Wangguo Quantu, which was a map of the world that was written in Chinese characters. Because of the Jesuits, there was a tremendous cultural exchange between the West and China, and it fused Western and Chinese thought and science. For instance, Confucius's writings, Master Kung's writings, were translated into Latin and other languages of the West, and meanwhile, works of philosophy such as Aquinas and Aristotle and so forth were translated into Chinese so that the Chinese could read them. Jesuits served on the board of astronomy, and they presented Chinese civilization to the West, which was very eager for knowledge about this. Ricci is on the verge of getting the Chinese to convert en masse to Christianity. He had already converted several of the great lords of China, when all of a sudden new missionaries showed up, and they were Dominicans and Franciscans. They arrived and they began to advocate for strict adherence to the Roman rites, rather than through a combination of Confucian and Christian practices that the Jesuits had no problem with. This ignited what was known as the rites controversy, in which these missionaries attempted to sublimate the culture of China to Western ideas and Western orthodoxy. You can see Western exceptionalism on full display here. Eventually, the Vatican sided with the Orthodox and against the Jesuits, and Pope Clement XI issued a papal bull condemning the Chinese rites in 1715. As a result of this, China said thanks but no thanks to Christianity. The emperor forbade any further missionary activity in China, and 500 million people went unconverted, an issue which still bears bitter fruit to this day. Now, the West were very much with a high opinion of themselves and had Western exceptionalism, but the Chinese also believed themselves to be exceptional as well. They treated all the states except Russia as vassals. They believed themselves to be the Middle Kingdom. Now, the Middle Kingdom means that you're the center of the earth and everything revolves around you. No better example of this existed than what was known as the kowtow. In imperial Chinese protocol, the kowtow is an act of deep respect shown by prostration, that is, kneeling and bowing so low as to have one's head touching the ground. In Chinese culture, the kowtow is the highest sign of reverence and was widely used to show reverence for one's elders, superiors, and especially the emperor, as well as for religious and cultural objects of worship. China saw all cultures and civilizations around it as peripheral to its own civilization. So you see here two very stubborn cultures that simply can't get along. Now, the only exception to this rule was Russia. The Chinese viewed the Russians at times as equals, mostly because of the Russian proximity to China and relative power that it could wield on areas like Mongolia and Inner Mongolia as well, which is right off the Great Wall of China. This is a painting by a Western artist named Beauvais. These are Jesuit astronomers of the Jesuit China missions, along with the Kangxi Emperor. In this colored illustration, you see on the left Matteo Ricci, who is in Confucian dress with the emperor on his right. And you can see how Ricci was able to get the Chinese to accept Christianity, but to accept it on Chinese Confucian terms. Because remember, many of these religions of the Far East are syncretic religions. You can blend religions together, just as Hindu and Islam. You could have Zen Buddhism and Shinto. You could have Mahayana Buddhism and Christianity. But Rome was not allowing that to happen. Of course, I can't let this lesson go without showing you one of the finest and most historic examples of harmonious structure in the world, and that is, of course, the Forbidden City in Beijing. Now, as opposed to Edo Castle, the Imperial City of Japan, the Forbidden City in Beijing is this is the grandest series of where the emperor sat in the palace. Now, what you see here is the Hall of Supreme Harmony, which is the largest building in which the final scene of the movie The Last Emperor, which was filmed in 1987, directed by Bernardo Bertolucci and starring Peter O'Toole and John Lone as Emperor Puyi. Took place. The Last Emperor was the first film that the Chinese communists allowed to be filmed within the Forbidden City. And The Last Emperor is a great movie, and as you can tell by this point, I'm a rather big fan of some movies and have actually assigned some to you. So please, by all means, take advantage of the extra credit that you have here. And so this brings an end to our study of the Chinese culture for this moment. We will get back to China later on in this lesson, but you can see that if you're going to have a study in world history, you've got to understand how countries and empires like the Mughals, like the Japanese, and like the Chinese interact with the West, and how it shapes the issues and concerns and relations that we have to this very day. Thank you.